This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. I'm going to assume you've been waiting around for this show to start, right? Well, I'm not going to hold you up. Let's get into it. Election interference is a real concern, especially with the upcoming general election. But national security experts believe Americans aren't getting enough information about foreign efforts to influence the election. Plus, a good chunk of the 2020 electorate, the youngest eligible voters, are energized by voting by mail, but many don't know how or have the resources to do so. We'll have more on that. But first, here's what you need to know right now. President Trump said he knew how deadly the coronavirus was and intentionally minimized its danger in the early days of the pandemic. That's according to newly released recordings from veteran journalist Bob Woodward.
It goes through air, Bob. That's always tougher than the touch. You know, the touch, you don't have to touch things, right? But the air, you just breathe the air. That's how it's passed. And so that's a very tricky one. That's a very delicate one. It's also more deadly than your strenuous flus. I wanted to always play it down. I still like playing it down.
Yes.
Because I don't want to create a panic.
The Washington Post first reported on the content of those interviews. They were conducted as a part of Woodward's upcoming book on the Trump presidency called Rage, and it happened before the first wave of the coronavirus really hit the US. Here's what Trump had to say about those interviews during a press briefing.
I don't want people to be frightened. I don't want to create panic, as you say. And certainly I'm not going to drive this country or the world into a frenzy.
The US currently leads the world in coronavirus cases and deaths, with more than 6 million cases and nearly 200,000 deaths. By now, you've probably seen the headline regarding AstraZeneca putting their COVID-19 vaccine trial on hold for a safety review. According to the director of the National Health Institute, one volunteer from the UK suffered a serious symptom, but they didn't specify what that symptom was. That's the only recorded illness so far. This is a unique moment, seeing that every development of a vaccine trial is of high public interest. And while the trial pause might sound alarming, it's actually pretty common and considered a routine action. The review will look into the factors that caused the sickness and see if it was directly triggered by the vaccine. An independent board will also continue to monitor results of other participants that already got the vaccine. There's been mixed messages on the timeline for a vaccine. Last week, the federal government told states to prepare to distribute a coronavirus vaccine by November 1st, one of the earliest estimates so far, but no vaccine has been approved yet.
We have, as the chairman said, started to manufacture doses of all these vaccines before we know if they work, understanding that we are spending hundreds of millions of dollars for vaccine doses that we may have to throw away if they don't work.
This week, 9 drug companies pledged not to submit a vaccine candidate for FDA review until safety and efficacy was shown in large-scale clinical trials. That pledge comes as concerns grow over the expedited process. Things look straight up apocalyptic in Oregon as smoke from wildfires blanket the western US. In Washington state, more acres burned Tuesday than the state typically sees burned in a year. A town of 200 people in the eastern part of the state was completely destroyed. In California, winds fueled several flames, including the Creek Fire, that's burned more than 152,000 acres and is nowhere near contained. That's on top of California's recent heat waves and rolling power outages. Meanwhile, parts of Colorado got 6 inches of snow, setting its earliest freeze on record, just 2 days after hitting 101 degrees. Some good news though, the cold brought some much needed relief to fires burning there. In August, U.S. counterintelligence officials said foreign states would use a range of tactics to influence U.S. voters' preferences and perspectives, specifically calling out Russia, China, and Iran. But some national security experts believe those warnings aren't reaching the American people. Newsy's Sasha Ingber explains.
National security experts fear Americans aren't getting enough information about foreign efforts to influence the election.
It would appear to me that there is information that's being withheld from either the American people or perhaps even withheld from inside elements of the government, either to help Trump or to not upset Trump.
Larry Pfeiffer was the chief of staff at the Central Intelligence Agency under President George W. Bush and the senior director of the White House Situation Room under President Barack Obama. He spoke with Newsy after the nation's top intelligence official announced his office would stop in-person briefings to Congress on election threats.
I'm going to continue to keep the promises that I made. I'm going to continue to follow the law. I'm going to continue to keep Congress informed. But we've had a pandemic of information being leaked out of the intelligence community, and I'm going to take the measures to make sure that that stops.
Among the latest intelligence leaks to media, bulletins from the Department of Homeland Security sounding alarm bells that Russia is looking to sow mistrust in mail-in voting and to denigrate the mental health of Democratic nominee Joe Biden. The Trump administration says leaks jeopardize sources and methods, and a Homeland Security spokesperson says one assessment was delayed because of quality concerns, but the leaks can also tell a larger story.
When people have grave concerns about the direction of the country, they will often use intelligence to leak to their advantage. The more leaking there is, the more we as a country should worry there is something wrong with what's happening in our country.
President Trump has been wary to acknowledge that Russia interfered in the 2016 election. Renee DiResta, who testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee on Disinformation, explains why.
Regardless of whether or not the collusion did, the interference happened. But I think that that conflation, particularly for the president who felt that even the interference potentially delegitimized his election in the minds of certain people, it was very hard for that to be separated out.
A slew of firings and resignations inside the intelligence and diplomacy community, some linked to Russian matters, worries scholars like Sarah Jane CORKE, president of the North American Society for Intelligence History.
I don't think we have ever seen anything the likes of which we have over the last 3.5 years.
The White House National Security Council declined to comment. A spokesperson says it has convened dozens of interagency meetings on securing the 2020 elections in the past year alone. Counterintelligence Chief Bill Evanina highlighted the foreign threats to Newsy.
Malign foreign influence on the U.S. ecosystem is huge, and that's coming from Iran, China, and Russia.
Evanina warns China and Iran are undercutting President Trump, while Russia is undermining former Vice President Joe Biden. Republicans and Democrats have picked their greatest foes.
I believe it's China because I've seen the intelligence. That's what I've concluded.
Russia is actively 24/7 interfering in our election.
Well, as a historian, I'm very cognizant that what we hear right now is sort of the tip of the iceberg.
Sasha Ingber, Newsy.
When you're back, we'll pay tribute to the matriarch of one of the most chaotic entertainment families on television in our trending topics. There's something that President Trump really thinks he deserves. So much so, he tweeted about it 17 times within 30 minutes. And there's at least one other person who agrees with him. Here's what's trending. The Nobel Peace Prize is trending because a far-right Norwegian lawmaker said Wednesday he nominated President Trump for the award for a peace agreement between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. The UAE and Israel are set to sign a peace agreement at the White House on September 15th. The Norwegian Nobel Committee doesn't release names of nominees until 50 years later, but that doesn't stop folks from blabbing about who they nominated. 4 US presidents and a vice president have previously won the Nobel Peace Prize. There are trailer drops, then there's what Warner Brothers did with the Dune trailer today. Fans of the franchise got a first look of Timothée Chalamet as Paul Atreides, the main character of the film, as well as a Q&A with some of the cast of the film, including Rebecca Ferguson, Oscar Isaac, Zendaya, and others. Dune is originally based on a 1965 novel and was first brought to the big screen in 1984. This latest reboot is directed by Denis Villeneuve, and don't worry, there's a giant sandworm in this one too. Starting in 2021, you'll have to find another way to keep up with one of the most well-known entertainment families. The Kardashian-Jenner family said in a joint statement that after 20 seasons, they are calling it quits with their reality TV show. They didn't say why they were stepping away, but we'd be remiss if we didn't give it up for a show that provided us with a treasure trove of gifable moments like Kris Jenner oddly holding a handgun, Kris Jenner dragging Kim over her 72-day marriage.
I'm married for 72 days. Really, that was normal.
Or Kris Jenner just...
Kim, you're doing amazing, sweetie.
Okay, we'll miss Kris Jenner the most. There, I said it. Stop me if you've heard this one before, but this year's general election could have more people voting by mail than ever before. At least 75% of American voters will be eligible to vote by mail, and a good chunk of them are millennials and Gen Zers. But as Newsy's Shira Tarlow reports, many of them lack the necessary resources to access mail-in ballots.
The youngest Americans are set to make up the largest share of the 2020 electorate. About 37% will be millennials and Gen Zers.
If we show up, we determine the election.
But the coronavirus could threaten turnout. To reduce the health risk posed by the pandemic, nearly every state has expanded access to absentee and mail-in voting. But young people may still struggle to make their voices heard at the ballot box. More than half of voters under the age of 35 say they lack the resources to vote by mail. A recent report by the Progressive Next Gen found 46% do not have access to a printer if they need to print a ballot application, and more than half don't know how to get a mail-in ballot or the ballot deadlines in their state. Voters of every age face these challenges, but experts say they can be more of a problem for those without experience casting a ballot.
Vote by mail, when done effectively, is really great for the democratic process and really great for young people. The key thing is just making sure that young people have those resources in order to be able to successfully do it.
Republicans are also making efforts to reach young voters, though polling shows younger generations largely back Democrats. But even for Democrats, engaging young voters can be challenging, especially those who are non-white and low income, who may face even more barriers to casting a ballot. Still, young voters in the survey say they are more motivated to vote this fall than in any prior election, and NextGen, focused on promoting youth voter engagement, is eager to capitalize on that enthusiasm. The group texted absentee voting information to 3.7 million people across 11 battleground states in August as part of its first ever National Vote by Mail Day.
What we have basically found in our research and just in talking with young voters for a long time is basically that for this election, they're really excited and fired up to vote, and the motivation levels are really high. The key thing is just making sure that they know the steps of the process in order to cast a ballot.
Shira Tarlow, Newsy, Washington.
TMI, but I'm going to run to the restroom real quick. If I'm not back before the ads are over, just get started without me. The 2020 U.S. Census is not going great. The once-in-a-decade count, which helps determine how much federal government money is set aside for communities, has been severely disrupted by the coronavirus pandemic. As an example, leaders in some college towns like Tempe, Arizona, home of Arizona State University, are worried about insufficient funding because some students who should be in dorms are instead being counted at their parents' homes or other locations. And then there are cities like El Paso, Texas, that faces a different set of challenges. It's a mostly Hispanic, Spanish-speaking community. Some people are undocumented, and there are some who commute across the border on a daily basis. It's actually pretty normal. National reporter Thomas Hoppall tells us about a local group working to ensure people in the El Paso community, including undocumented immigrants, aren't undercounted in this year's census.
The census is one of the most important endeavors that the United States government embarks upon every 10 years.
It helps to determine how billions of dollars are distributed to communities nationwide.
Towns on the southern border of the United States, often referred to as the borderland, have a challenge every 10 years, and that is the U.S. Census.
El Paso is a predominantly Hispanic and Spanish-speaking community.
Border towns like El Paso are already difficult to count.
David Stout is an El Paso County Commissioner.
10 years ago, we were only able to get about 71 or 72% of our population counted. You know, people that may not be, that are undocumented, that live in this community. You have people that are, moving back and forth across the border.
Stout is among some lawmakers worried about the census when it comes to undocumented immigrants.
That could very heavily affect El Paso County because we anecdotally have about 60 to 70,000 undocumented immigrants in this community.
The Trump administration has made it clear it doesn't believe documented immigrants should be included in the census.
Well, it's in our Constitution. Our Constitution mandates that every person is counted that's living in our country every 10 years in the census.
Paulina Lopez is with the U.S. Census Bureau.
The census mission is to count everyone once, only once, and in the right place. So no matter their immigration status, they need to be counted in the census.
The vast majority of undocumented immigrants pay taxes, okay? Unless they're living in a tent under a bridge, they're paying property taxes, whether it's directly or indirectly, right? If they own a home, they rent a place, they're paying property taxes.
And that's where Denise Vasquez comes in. She's with En La Frontera Todos Cantamos, translated to We All Count on the Border. Her group goes around trying to get people, including undocumented immigrants, to fill out the census.
And a lot of them feel or they think that they should not be counted in the census because they're not U.S. citizens, but that's part of our challenge here is informing everyone that everyone counts in the census.
And unfortunately, border towns are behind. El Paso itself is only at a 62% response rate, according to the census.
And we need to have 150,000 more people fill out their questionnaire in the next 4 weeks for us to be able to get to that 80%. We've been told that for every head, you would miss out on about $1,500 a year.
Things are more difficult now that the deadline has been cut a month short, but if they don't get their numbers up by the end of the month, it could be a harder 10 years for them.
We're in this situation where I don't even know if we're going to get to the population count that we had last time.
I'm Thomas Hopper reporting.
If this was a corny show, I'd probably say something like, I'm counting on you, get it, to reach out to us on Twitter using the hashtag Newsy in the Loop. But we're not that kind of show. So when it comes to COVID-19 and how deadly the disease can be, pollution and air quality are a big factor. Just yesterday, we reported on how poor air quality from wildfires can make things worse for people with allergies or asthma and make them even more susceptible to COVID-19, an illness that affects the respiratory system. But the impacts of pollution are deeper for some communities than others, and particularly it's communities of color who feel it the worst. Newsy's virology series has been breaking down the coronavirus since day one of the pandemic. In this episode, we show how pollution is making this virus even deadlier for people of color across the U.S.
Months into the COVID-19 pandemic, the data on who is getting sick and dying from the disease reveals a disturbing pattern. The novel coronavirus is infecting and killing people of color at disproportionate rates in the U.S. Take Detroit, for example. While Black people make up 38% of the city's population, they account for 68% of positive tests and 76% of the deaths attributed to COVID-19. In Arizona, Native Americans, who make up 4% of the population, account for 19% of deaths. In New York City, Hispanics make up 29% of the population, but 34% of cases of COVID-19 related deaths. There are lots of reasons why COVID-19 has increased risks for Black and Brown Americans. But easily overlooked is one reason that we are reminded of every time we step outside: the quality of the air we breathe. Some pollution can be easily seen, but much of it remains invisible to the human eye. The air pollution that's most harmful to health are tiny inhalable particles known as particulate matter. These are 35 times smaller than a grain of sand, but in large concentrations can make air look hazy. Wildfires, emissions from power plants, and the burning of gasoline by cars and natural gas to heat buildings all contribute to higher levels of this microscopic pollution.
Take, for example, the number of bus depots. In the island of Manhattan, 6 out of the 7 bus depots are located north of 100th Street. That's not by coincidence. It's because not many people want polluting facilities in their backyards, but when it comes to Black and brown neighborhoods, many times these polluting facilities get placed there.
According to one study, Black people are exposed to 21% more pollution than the overall U.S. population. Hispanics are exposed 12% more.
people have been disproportionately exposed to environmental hazards and environmental pollutants that's been the predisposition that has set them up to, be more susceptible to the virus.
When a person breathes in pollution like PM 2.5, the tiny particles can penetrate the lungs and enter the bloodstream. It can trigger or worsen chronic respiratory conditions like hypertension, asthma, bronchitis, diabetes, even heart disease.
Hell, my son has asthma, my daughter has asthma, I have asthma. We smell the poison, but what the hell can we do about it? That's the question.
Hilton Kelly is an environmental activist in Texas who has worked to protect the health of communities living in close proximity to big polluters.
It seems like no matter what disease come out, African Americans are always more susceptible and more likely to die from it.
Many of these underlying medical conditions can increase complications in coronavirus patients.
The global burden of disease has evaluated the air pollution levels in the United States. And for example, their estimate comes out just about 100,000 people die every year from air pollution, die prematurely, but earlier than they would have.
During a pandemic, there's historical evidence that poor air quality contributes to the death toll. When researchers at Carnegie Mellon and the University of Montreal examined how air pollution impacted death rates during the 1918 flu pandemic, they found that cities that burned high amounts of coal experienced tens of thousands more deaths than cities that used less coal. In more recent history, during an outbreak of SARS in 2003, patients from regions in China with higher levels of air pollution were twice as likely to die compared to those from regions with lower air pollution. Researchers are currently investigating whether this pattern holds true for COVID-19 as well.
The entire United States, people are affected by air pollution. It's just a question of how much and how susceptible they are. And that's a big factor, as we're learning in the COVID crisis.
Reducing the racial gaps in COVID-19 deaths will require addressing systematic problems, including unequal access to clean air.
So, things like climate change, environmental degradation, racism, wealth inequity, these have all existed far longer than when this crisis arrived.
Really, if we wanted to try and address this problem, I think you really have to go at the underlying force, which is equity.
That's it for us, folks. As always, thanks for watching. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. I live here now. More top stories from Newsy are headed your way right now.